Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Fit Geek Show. Uh, just like every week, I try to get in guests from around the world who have expertise in their own areas of interest. And today with us, we have Dr. Nadia Pateguana, all the way from Lisbon, Portugal. And she's going to address us today with regards to PCOS management, which is a very common issue that women are facing throughout the world, especially in India. I was pretty surprised that few of my clients were facing this issue, and I was trying to read a book on it, and I came across her recently published book, which I think got published in April 2020. Am I correct,
Yes.
Dr. Nadia? Yes, and it's an audio book. So I'm a person who doesn't like to read much, like physically, and I like to hear things. So when I'm doing my work, I can listen to things. So it's on Storytel, and it's for free as of now. So and the book was really good. So that's why I decided to approach Dr. Nadia, who is a naturopathic doctor. She is a dietary coach, and she's also now an author. And she's authored this book with the very renowned Dr. Jason Fung, who is very famous for his fasting method of dieting. So thank you so much, Dr. Nadia, for joining us today. And I wish to learn a lot from you, and a lot of our listeners will also learn a lot from you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I was I was pleasantly surprised that a gentleman like you in the fitness world wanted to talk to me about PCOS. And I'm glad that I got a chance to get to know you a little bit and talk to you about your experience with your uh, clients, exercise clients. But I wasn't surprised that somebody in India was interested in talking to me about this because I have a lot of clients in India. I work for the fasting method.
Mhm,
.com online program, and so we speak with people all over the world. I have
mhm,
a lot of clients in India, particularly women with diabetes, obesity, and
mhm,
PCOS, men as well with diabetes. So I wasn't surprised. I know it's talked about quite a bit in India. I speak with doctors in India. Actually, I had
mhm.
a call with someone not too long ago who did an interview like this. So I'm so happy that you found my book accidentally online and an audio book at that, because the PCOS plan is not just on audio, it's also paperback. So if you
Yes.
have Amazon or some sort of delivery service, and it's also on Kindle. The audiobook, I was very happy to hear, is available in some places for free. Although I've heard only one bad thing about it is that the audio version doesn't have the practical section of the recipes. So that's the only thing that I've heard people complain about, and then they end up getting one of the other versions so that they can get to the recipes and all of that stuff.
Mhm.
So thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And to begin with, I'd like to ask you how you specialize in this field of nutrition and science, PCOS management.
So the first chapter of the book of the PCOS plan is really about introducing myself and other women that I've worked with. So I am a naturopathic doctor by training. I think this is my 17th year in practice. And I started working. I went to school in Canada. I grew up in Canada, in nearby Toronto, Canada.
Mhm,
And I did a undergrad degree in biology, and then I did a naturopathic medicine degree because I wanted to obviously get into complementary medicine. I wanted to basically follow the principles of naturopathic medicine, which say to heal the body, cause no harm, and look at the body and the people as a whole, not
mhm,
as specific organs or specific symptoms. So for me, right from the very beginning, it was really important to treat concerns right from the root cause. So once I graduated from the naturopathic college, I actually went back to my home country. I went back to Mozambique, which is where I'm
mhm,
originally from. Mozambique is a country in Southeast Africa. So
mhm,
it is a Portuguese-speaking country because it was a former Portuguese colony. So I, as a young 24-year-old, I guess at the time, I went back to Mozambique, and I actually worked there for 10 years. I had a clinic, and I worked with other medical doctors. So it was a very nice sort of complementary medicine clinic, which focused not just in naturopathic medicine and nutrition, which is what I specialized in. I specialize in
mhm,
nutrition, but I worked with other medical doctors, which was a very good referral system, including psychiatrists and psychologists. We even had a hypnotherapist for a little while, but really gastroenterologists, gynecologists I worked very closely with. So it was a nice way to learn for me, to be honest. My first 10 years of practice were a very good learning experience. And I started nutrition very much with the old, a little bit better, but still with the old mentality of eat less and move more. Calories in, calories out. The
Mm-hmm.
idea of healthy carbs and
Mm-hmm.
healthy grains, low, low fat. I think I started with that idea, but very quickly in my journey, I realized that that wasn't very functional. So at some point, I started to introduce into my dietary plans what I called detoxes, quote unquote, or
Mm-hmm.
elimination diets. And these detoxes and elimination diets eliminated, of course, the foods that we know to be most troublesome today. And they started to introduce more of the healthier, real foods, including fats. So that's how my journey not began, but how it progressed. At some point in my professional journey, I started to realize that a lot of people, a lot of women were reporting that they were getting pregnant after
Mm-hmm.
following my dietary plan, even though they had struggled with sometimes over 10 years of infertility. So it became a very interesting, even though it wasn't my focus, it became an interesting part of my professional career. And I got a reputation for getting women pregnant. And it was quite funny in our town, our city, because I was the only person doing nutrition in our city at the time. So I was quite known. And so it became a bit of a joke, which was very good. And I saw a lot of women in their 30s and 40s at the time, even though their main interest for coming to me was weight loss initially. And I saw a lot of gentlemen for other concerns. Usually diabetes was a big one. The weight was secondary. And then in my late 20s, I myself started having trouble conceiving and having fertility issues. So after being diagnosed with PCOS, Polycystic Ovary Syndrome, and that's a long
Mm-hmm.
story, and I talk about it quite a bit in my videos and in my book if people are interested. But once I was diagnosed with PCOS, I decided to take matters into my own hands and sort of connect the dots. And I put myself on this very, very low carb diet.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that there was a link. I didn't know exactly what the link was, but I wasn't ovulating, and that was my main problem for not getting pregnant. And so I put myself on this low calorie, low carb, pardon me, not low calorie. It was actually
Mm-hmm.
high in calorie because I had fat and lots of protein. But
Mm-hmm.
of course, you know from reading my book that I got pregnant. And so this was very interesting for me. Long story short, fast forward 2 years, again, same issue. And then in talking with my friend and gynecologist, she connected the dots for me. And she said, of course, you're not getting pregnant, and why all of these approaches are working, including metformin, which is a diabetes drug, because PCOS is an insulin resistant condition. So she's the one that tied sort of, I guess we should know that because we are supposed to learn that in medical school. And it is in the
Mm-hmm.
literature. So once I've done research on PCOS, I know that the underlying cause is hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. So for those of you that don't know, insulin is a very important hormone that our body produces every time that we eat.
Mm-hmm.
But the more often we eat, so people that snack a lot are going to produce a lot more insulin. And also, insulin gets produced a lot more if you eat more carbohydrates, more sugars, more processed food.
Mm-hmm.
So that was obviously my case. I didn't eat a
Mm-hmm.
lot, but I ate very often and I ate a lot of sugars, including
Mm-hmm.
what we call healthy sugars, which, if you have an insulin concern, there is no such thing as a healthy sugar because all sugars are going to produce insulin. So that was the beginning of my journey, both professional and personal. And ever since then, this has been my focus. I now work, as you know, for the fasting method program with Dr. Fung and Megan Ramos, and have been for over 4 years. And we focus on people with metabolic syndrome caused by insulin resistance. And we help people to lower insulin and lower insulin resistance, become more insulin sensitive by following a real food, lower carb approach and intermittent fasting.
Wow, nice. Um, and I did read in your book that, as you mentioned, that you were eating a lot of like those healthy carbs, and also you were snacking a lot of candies all the time. I think I
I
heard
was
that as well.
snacking I was snacking on not candies all the time. I was snacking on fruit and healthy things all the time, but then at night I would eat tons of candy.
Okay, all right. So, so what in just short, what is PCOS, and what are the factors that cause it?
Okay. So PCOS is polycystic ovary syndrome. I know in India
Mhm.
it can be called sometimes polycystic ovary, I think, disease. I've heard
Yes,
people call
PCOD.
it PCOD.
Hmm.
Well, in most of the world, at least at this point, it's still considered a syndrome, which means it's a
Okay.
combination of symptoms. It's on a spectrum. It doesn't look the
Hmm.
same for everyone. It is
Hmm.
a diagnosis of exclusion, which means you're supposed to rule out other conditions, other similar conditions. And there are,
Hmm.
we talk about this a little bit in the book. But once women are diagnosed with PCOS, because it is the most common endocrine, so hormonal condition in young women, premenopausal
Hmm.
women, anywhere between 8 to maybe even 30% of women worldwide have PCOS. It is very common. Not only is it common, it's very serious.
Hmm.
The diagnosis of PCOS, as I said, first of all, it's a diagnosis of exclusion, but you can get diagnosed with PCOS if your doctor finds 2 out of 3 of the diagnostic criteria. There's a lot of other associated things to PCOS, but the diagnostic criteria basically are if you have expressions of male hormones. So there are many
Hmm.
expressions of male hormones, including facial hair and body hair and male pattern baldness and many other expressions and that women complain about, like acne and other
Hmm.
expressions, not technically on lab. You don't have to have high male hormones on lab, but you
Hmm.
do have to have expressions of, and this is very common. You see this all the time. Women with facial hair, even if they shave it, you can see it, the acne, the baldness, and this is very,
Hmm.
very bothersome. But besides it being bothersome, as I'll explain, it's actually very dangerous. It's a very dangerous condition, a very serious condition. So that's one of the diagnostic criteria. The second one is irregular cycles or lack of ovulation. So you might have
Hmm.
cycles but not ovulating, and that's a main concern, not just for a woman's health, but obviously for her fertility. And then the third diagnostic criteria is polycysts, so many cysts, or what looks like cysts. They're actually follicles, many
Hmm.
follicles, immature follicles on the ovary. So when the doctor does an ultrasound, they can see. So 2 out of these 3, and you can get diagnosed with PCOS. You might have all 3, which is what I had, and that's called the
Hmm.
frank type of PCOS. There are many other associated concerns like obesity, especially central obesity, but that is not one of the
Hmm.
diagnostic criteria. You don't have to be obese to be diagnosed with PCOS. I was not obese.
Hmm.
I did have fatty liver, but you couldn't see it, okay, on the
Hmm.
outside. I was very, very thin. I weighed less than 100 pounds when I was diagnosed with
Wow.
PCOS, and I was almost 30. So, and I'm still a
Hmm.
very thin individual. But when my insulin
Hmm.
goes up, which even over the last few years, depending on what's going on in my life, when my insulin goes up, I don't necessarily gain a lot of weight, but I do end up developing diabetes, which I ended up developing, hypertension, so high blood pressure. I've even had a type of cancer that's likely associated. And there's many other associated concerns which are very serious, especially later on in a woman's life as the PCOS and really as the metabolic syndrome progresses further along, meaning the higher your insulin and the more insulin resistant you become, the more of these you're going to likely develop. So PCOS is very common, but it's very debilitating. As I said, imagine a young woman, what a young woman goes through in her life when she has all of these expressions of male hormones, the irregular
Hmm.
cycles, the mood concerns, very debilitating, not being able to get pregnant for years and years. And then also very, very serious because as it progresses, if it's not treated, then it leads to these other very serious concerns. They're associated, like the diabetes, obesity,
Hmm.
other heart concerns, and possible cancers, and many other things.
So, so does insulin cause this primarily, or when a person is obese or like overweight and has high blood pressure, does metabolic syndrome cause PCOS, or is it just a cycle? I'm a little
Well, it
confused.
can be a cycle, but the root cause, the trigger is insulin and hyperinsulinemia.
Okay.
Okay. Metabolic syndrome, as you know, is also a syndrome, just like PCOS. It's
Hmm.
a collection of
Hmm.
symptoms, and somebody doesn't have to have the exact same symptoms as everyone else. And it's also on a spectrum, so it gets worse and worse over time. So if you start with diabetes, you'll likely develop obesity and hypertension and all in the
Hmm.
dyslipidemia with the abnormal cholesterol levels. It progresses. I think how you start, your initial expressions, I think that's genetic. Like for me, my initial expression is not obesity, but I eventually start to gain weight. So the root cause is not obesity. It's not obesity that leads to PCOS. It's insulin and insulin resistance. Now, what causes the hyperinsulinemia, so the overproduction of insulin, can sometimes be multifactorial. I have seen and I have heard and I've talked to many people that believe that there are 4 types of PCOS, and that one of them is insulin resistant, and the other 3 are, one is inflammatory PCOS, the other one's adrenal PCOS. But once you look deeper into these other ones, you see that the problem is that these other concerns raise your insulin. For example, adrenal concerns. If you produce too much cortisol or stress hormone, then your body goes into this fight or flight response, starts to burn off or put out some sugar into your blood, and as a consequence, your body starts to overproduce insulin. So all of these other thought to be root causes of PCOS end up causing insulin resistance. So ultimately, insulin is the culprit. And Dr. Fung wrote about this in our book, in the chapters that detail how insulin is behind this. So then it's the high insulin that causes a woman's ovaries to overproduce testosterone in a particular place because the ovaries have receptors for insulin. So if there's too much insulin and it basically gets too many messages from insulin, because that's what hormones do. They give messages to the body to produce other things. So when you get too many messages from insulin, you overproduce other things. So in this case, in the ovaries, you overproduce the male hormones. But it also sends an abnormal message to the liver, for the liver to underproduce this very important sex hormone binding globulin. So if you have less of this globulin and more testosterone, this globulin binds to testosterone so that it doesn't go all over the body and cause these symptoms, these expressions. So if it's properly bound, if there's enough sex hormone binding globulin binding the testosterone, then it takes the testosterone only where it needs to go, and it doesn't overexpress itself. So you don't have to have only high levels of testosterone. Maybe you have high levels of testosterone caused by the extra insulin, but you also have low levels of sex hormone binding globulin. So now you have more free testosterone because it's not bound. If it's free, it goes wherever and it expresses itself on the skin, on the hair, and on the body. Okay, so that's how we know insulin is behind this, and it's the number one thing. We also know that insulin is behind the other 2. So not just the male expressions, but the irregular ovulation and menstruation. It's exactly the same pattern of too much testosterone that causes what's called follicular arrest. And follicular arrest means that before your follicles are fully mature and ready to ovulate, you get all of these follicles, so all of your eggs, let's say, in your ovaries, they all grow to a certain mid-level, but instead of getting one mature egg that comes out every month and you ovulate and potentially get pregnant, you get all of these immature follicles. That's why you see that ring of pearls on the ovaries of all of these little cysts that are actually these mid-growth follicles that none of them actually matured. And that's what you see on ultrasound. So insulin is behind that as well. So it's behind lack of ovulation, but also the appearance of the ovaries on ultrasound. Too much insulin causes all 3 diagnostic criteria and the associated criteria. So the diabetes comes from too much insulin. The obesity comes from too much insulin and too much fat storage, et cetera, et cetera.
And since it's a hormonal issue, I've also heard of complaints about mood swings, fluctuating thyroid levels, insomnia, and lack of losing weight, or like difficulty in losing weight. So are these common in PCOS?
They're very common, just like they are. Well, the best example I can give you is PMS, premenstrual syndrome. Premenstrual syndrome, as we understand it, is a hormonal concern caused by at the very end of a woman's cycle, right? Just before her period. And it's caused by, a fluctuation of hormones. So at half of your cycle, you have a dominant hormone, and the other half, you have another dominant hormone. But we also know that this second dominant hormone causes your body to be a little bit more insulin resistant. So it's at the very end of your cycle when this other hormone is higher and you're a little bit more insulin resistant, meaning you produce more insulin every time that you eat, that you have all of these concerns. You've got bloating, irritability, and all of the symptoms, cravings, all of the symptoms that we associate with PCOS. So we see how hormones can influence each other. So yes, this hormonal condition, this high insulin, causes all of these symptoms. Insulin is a very important hormone. It's an endocrine hormone. It's a metabolic hormone. It basically, its main function we thought, well, we know it's one of its functions is to regulate your blood sugars when at appropriate levels. It's able to do that. Its other function is to determine whether you store fat or burn fat. If insulin is
Mm.
low, then you burn. If insulin is high, you store more. So the higher your insulin gets, and the more insulin resistant you become. And insulin resistance is basically just means that if you overproduce insulin, eventually your body becomes resistant to it. So you need to produce more
Mm.
in order for your body to respond. And the more that cycle, the more resistant you become, the more insulin your body has to keep producing to do the exact same job. So more insulin resistance means you're going to have more abnormal blood sugars, even if you don't have them to begin
Mhm.
with, more fat storage, particularly in the liver, for
Mhm.
people like me that don't become very overweight initially. But in other people genetically, they fat storage in their adipose tissue, right, in their fat cells. So
Mhm.
these other concerns, we are now realizing, okay, so insulin is not just metabolic and endocrine metabolic hormone, it's also reproductive, has reproductive
Mm.
functions. It affects, as we've talked about, your testosterone production. It gets affected by progesterone production. So it's these hormones communicate with each other, and if there's a if it's deregulated, then you have all of these expressions, symptoms of
Mhm.
disease, right? So yes, I
Mhm.
do think that insulin is behind this, and I think that it causes this unbalance in the
Okay.
female reproductive hormones.
Okay. And so through nutrition, exercise, and maybe some other tips, a person can reverse PCOS eventually. Is that correct, or does it take a long time to recover from this?
Well, the time of how long it would take for somebody to recover depends on many factors. It depends on
Mhm.
how far along the spectrum you are, and it also depends on what you're doing. Okay.
Mhm.
Many times I see women trying to reverse their PCOS, but they're all over the place. They're not focusing on the most important thing, which is insulin.
Mhm.
If you don't focus and if you don't actually lower insulin, then
Mhm.
you're just kind of going up and down on the spectrum because you're focusing on all these different things. And women are very conflicted because they hear a lot of conflicting information, what they're told, what to eat, how to eat, how to
Mhm.
exercise, what supplements to take, and they end up getting overwhelmed. And sometimes they're doing this and sometimes they're doing that. And in the end, they're going one step forward, two steps back. Okay. So do I think PCOS can be reversed? Absolutely. Why? Because it's an expression of metabolic syndrome that's on a spectrum. If you increase your insulin production, you're going to go further on the
Mhm.
spectrum. If you lower your insulin production, you're going to come uh, all the way down. If your expressions and symptoms of PCOS go away, then you can no longer say you have PCOS. That's why it's a syndrome, right?
Oh.
So I had
Mhm.
PCOS. I was diagnosed with PCOS when I was in my late 20s. I had
Mhm.
all three expressions, right? After my journey and learning what I've learned, I've lowered my insulin enough that all three of my expressions are gone. So now how can I get diagnosed with PCOS?
Mhm.
So can you reverse it? Absolutely. Have I seen other women reverse it and help other women reverse it? That's exactly why we wrote this book and why we're here. Now, what do you have to do? That's the question, right? You have to lower insulin. And lucky for
Mhm.
us, we know how to lower insulin. It's very simple. You lower insulin by eating less often,
Mhm.
also known as intermittent fasting, as opposed to eating all day long. Regardless if you're eating healthy or unhealthy, if you're eating all day long, your insulin production keeps going up. If insulin goes up, your syndrome is going to go up further on the spectrum. So you eat less often. That's the most important thing. You need to learn how to eat first.
Mhm.
Second, you eat foods that are going to create less of an insulin response. So you're going to choose foods that are rich and nutritious but don't produce as much insulin. All three of our macronutrients produce insulin, okay? Carbohydrates, protein, and fat.
Mhm.
Carbohydrates, even the healthy carbohydrates, produce the most amount of insulin. Protein produces a moderate amount of insulin. And fat produces an insignificant amount of insulin. Healthy fats, I mean,
Mhm.
because there are lots of processed fats out there that we want to stay away from as well, right?
Mhm.
Industrial fats. So out of the three, you want a diet that's higher in fats so that you're satiated, satisfied, full, but you don't produce a ton of insulin. You want a moderate amount of protein because protein is essential and we require protein. But
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, too much protein, especially if you're insulin resistant, is going to get turned into stored as sugar in our body, right? Which eventually gets glycogen turns into fat. Okay, and the body can only store it as that.
Mm-hmm.
So you need the adequate amount so that you can do the things that you need to do with protein. But if you consume, and lots of people are told to consume a lot of protein. If you
Mm-hmm.
consume too much protein, it has to get stored. And through the liver, that's actually going to create further insulin resistance. Okay. And then the carbohydrates, whether they're healthy, quote unquote, or unhealthy, that it really defeats the purpose of what we're talking about. We're trying to lower insulin, right? So you're going to have to lower your carbohydrate intake. So higher fat, moderate protein, lower carb is the way to lower insulin. That's why the low carb, high fat diet is so common in the world of insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome and PCOS in particular.
Okay, and since you said, since you talked about nutrition, I also heard in your book that you said it's not really important to count calories all the time and focus more on what's on your plate. Uh, However, as we were discussing before, there are a lot of people in researchers in the exercise science field that don't really like this statement, and they say the calories in and calories out dictate the weight loss. And you know, they're saying that if you're intermittent fasting, you may be eating less and losing weight, and not just because of intermittent fasting. So what is your take on that? Because I have seen some videos of Dr. Jason Fung, and then a lot of people replying to that with not so happy things. So
I think people are very stuck with the status quo and they don't want
mm,
to look outside the box. The calorie in,
mm,
calorie out theory has been out there for over 50 years and people are defending it to its last drop, last breath. I think it's dying, but
mm,
unfortunately, there's still people defending it to its last breath because we as a human species have been the guinea pigs of this experiment that has gone extremely wrong. If the calorie in, calorie out theory was correct, we wouldn't have this metabolic syndrome, basically plague that we have. We wouldn't have so many people with diabetes and obesity and PCOS. Okay, we have
mm,
been told to eat less and move more for the last at least 50 years, and people have been trying to comply, and they're getting sicker and sicker and fatter and fatter, and I don't need to tell you that, you know that to be true. So
yeah,
calories, you know, if you understand calories, if you understand what they are, then you understand that our body doesn't respond to calories. Okay, our body
mm,
responds to hormones, and the calories are going to differ depending on which food they come from, right? Calories from
mm,
cookies are different than calories from broccoli. So the calorie in,
mm,
calorie out theory has to go out the window. The other big problem about calorie theories is that when you tell people to eat less calories, the foods that they choose to eat produce a lot of insulin and they don't
mm,
satiate people. So people are starving, they're eating all the time, and they're overproducing insulin, and they get sicker and sicker. So if you reduce your calories drastically and you increase your exercise drastically, will you drop some weight? You will initially, but then your body
mm,
accommodates very, very quickly. Your
true.
energy input and your energy output are not separate. Your body is not stupid, as Dr. Fung says. So if you all of a sudden start to eat less and start to exercise more, you will what's the word? You will surprise your body, right?
Mm,
And think you're being smarter, but very quickly your body will adapt. So is this going
mm,
to work? You're going to lose 10 pounds. Is this going to resolve PCOS? No. Is this going to resolve diabetes? No. Is this going to help somebody who's
mm,
morbidly obese lose 100 pounds? No, it's not. So what's the long-term approach, right? What's the sustainable? You can't starve people and make people feel like it's their fault, that they're lazy and gluttons for eating too much. People are not eating too much. People are eating too often, and people are eating the wrong foods. Do I think,
mm.
I know you want to talk about exercise because our book talks very little about exercise. Do I think
Yes.
exercise is essential and important? Absolutely. Do I think it's essential and important to lose weight? No. But I do think it's
True.
important and essential to build muscle. I
Mm,
think it's essential, and you need muscle. We can talk about it if you want, but it's essential.
mm,
You talked a little bit about how that impacts your insulin resistance, but
mm,
you need exercise first and foremost for your mood, for your mental health, for sleep, for
mm,
adrenal control and cortisol and stress hormones. Remember, I said to you at the beginning that if you have problems with your adrenals and your cortisol production and stress hormone production, you're going to have more insulin resistance. So exercise
Mm-hmm.
is one of the key factors for that alone. Not the only one, again, but it does indirectly help you lower your insulin.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And since I'm really biased towards resistance training because I love resistance training, I know and I've read some articles where it mentions that resistance training helps with insulin sensitivity, and it's also really essential for people with diabetes for management of diabetes. So, what do you think about that? Is muscle mass really essential for insulin health, or is it not, or how does it go?
Insulin health of muscles. But unfortunately, we have
Yes, yes.
a lot more organs in our body, particularly our
Mm,
liver, which is not a muscle, and a lot of our insulin resistance
mm,
happens there. So again, do I think exercise is essential? I do.
mm,
Do I think
mm,
resistance training is essential? Particularly, yes.
mhm,
I think as we get older, one of the most important things for our quality of life and longevity is muscle mass. So
mhm,
I do. But again, remember I was saying how women are doing this and then they're doing that and then they're doing this, and I'm always
yes.
telling them to focus. Do I want women to exercise? Absolutely. But if they don't focus on how they eat and what they eat, they're not going to reverse their insulin resistance. Once they
Mm,
understand that and once they follow that, then yes, I think exercise is essential. They can do it at the same time as long as they don't lose focus. Don't lose focus. The other thing that I see happen, especially about women, and I want to address this because I know you're talking to women
mhm,
today, is when women
mhm,
start exercising, they get very concerned because they get more hungry. Their appetite
mm,
increases. And I say, no problem. Eat more. Just don't eat more often and don't eat more of the things that are going to raise insulin. And this is the important thing, is that women then get confused because they're trying to starve themselves by eating a low fat, low calorie diet, and they're
mhm,
exercising, but their appetite increases because again, if you exercise more, you're going to need to eat more. Remember, your body
mhm,
is not disconnected. It's completely
mhm,
connected. So you try to surprise your body by eating less and exercising more, but you can only do that for so long. Then you're starving. And when you exercise more, you should eat more. So it's not about
mhm,
calories, it's about how often you eat. So eat more, don't eat more often. Don't snack just because you're exercising. Eat more at your meals, adjust. If you need to eat more, eat more. If you feel hungrier, then it's completely normal and expected that you would eat more. Just eat more of the adequate protein because now you're
mhm,
exercising, and eat more of the adequate healthy fat, and focus on which carbohydrates you can eat that will have less of an insulin response, right?
mhm,
Carbohydrates are the non-essential factor here. You don't actually need carbohydrates. I know people
mhm,
say that they do, but if you look back in science, your body has the ability to make glucose from protein and fat, right?
mhm,
Gluconeogenesis. So if you do eat a low carb, moderate protein, higher fat diet, your body will produce. There are many people that can attest to this from doing years and years of very low carb diet, and their brain functions just fine, their red blood cells function just fine. So your body has the ability to adapt to this. Is this a choice that all will make? I don't know. And do you have to? I don't know. But if you have PCOS, then you have to lower insulin.
mm. I'm glad this comes from a female about the eating more part, because when I tell a few of my female clients, they don't believe me because they think because I'm a male, it's easy for me to digest all the food. So
That's
glad you brought this up.
Well, we say this in the book, and I will repeat it because I am a
Mhm,
woman that had PCOS, and I am the perfect example because I was thin. So people then are more likely to believe me if I say this.
mhm,
If somebody's overweight, they don't believe it. Although
mhm,
I was dismissed, my doctor didn't think I had PCOS because I was thin. If I had been overweight, he would have looked deeper into it. I had to push him further. But anyhow,
mhm,
PCOS women don't eat more. They don't eat too much. They just eat too much sugar, and they eat more often.
mhm,
They
mhm,
crave sugar, and so they're often trying to find healthier substitutes, but they're constantly eating some type of carbohydrate and sugar and all the time because they're craved. So we
mhm,
need to address that. Okay, I always tell people, I teach people how, don't feed the beast. Don't feed the insulin beast.
mhm,
You're constantly feeding the beast. It gets bigger and bigger. You want to tame the beast or kill the beast by eating things that are not going to raise insulin.
mhm.
Okay,
So how many hours of fasting do you recommend?
it depends.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you what I do recommend always, first and foremost, for everyone.
Mhm.
TRE, time restricted eating. I think everyone should
Okay.
have full meals, no snacks. That's called time restricted eating. Okay. I also often call it intermittent eating. Okay. Because you may not be trying to fast, but how you eat. So you don't want to
Mhm.
have these constant insulin production throughout the day. You want to have an adequate insulin production, and then you want an adequate amount of time for that insulin to come down. As Dr. Fung says, you need this balanced hormonal state, fed and
Mhm.
fasted states, as people always did before. So with the food industry and all these other influences and all these bunk theories of calorie in, calorie out, people are eating all the time. So they're in a very abnormal, irregular, and unbalanced hormonal state. Okay.
Mhm.
So TRE, eat and then stop for an adequate amount of time. And for most people, that has to be at least 4 hours. And then,
Mhm.
but unfortunately, that's not a therapeutic fasting approach. That's probably a good maintenance approach. So when we look at therapeutic fasting and healing of diabetes, of PCOS, of obesity, of all other associated metabolic syndrome conditions, and now we've got so many that are associated, then you have to look at some, and in the book, we actually mentioned a few. We mentioned the 24-hour alternate day fasting
Mhm.
cycle. There's the, I think, 36 and 42 in the book as well. There are
Okay.
others. People do extended fasting for healing purposes, and I think that in some cases that makes a lot of sense if you're doing it adequately and appropriately and safely. Many people do extended fasting on their own, some safely and some not. So that's a
Mhm.
concern of mine.
I completely agree because I don't know about the PCOS part. I've not seen it with my eyes, but with the diabetes part, my dad, somebody suggested him to start fasting, and he started fasting for I think about 14 hours or 15 hours, and then eating all his food within the next 9 hours. And within just 2 months, he lost 8 kilos, and his diabetes went down like a significant level to that extent that when he used to go out, people used to say that, what happened to you, are you healthy, are you not healthy, you lost so much weight. But I see his plate every day and he doesn't eat less, he eats enough, but at the same time he got the effective therapy for his diabetes. So I completely vouch for that. It's a great idea.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. It's even better that that's your father. I'm very, very
Yes.
happy to hear that.
Yes. And okay, so coming back to the nutrition part, are there certain food groups that people with PCOS should avoid
So we're
apart
always
from
talking
carbohydrate?
We're always talking about the same three macros, in my opinion. If you want to get deeper, and
Hmm.
we do get deeper. I have a food pyramid that I share with people and that I follow. At the base of that food
Okay.
pyramid, I basically have the foods that are going to have the least insulin response, and that's in the book as well. So the base foods, the fat fast foods, as some people call them, and it's a combination of foods: some vegetables, some fats, some fruits, and some proteins. Okay, so there's a combination of foods that are going to have the least insulin response. And then as you go
Hmm.
further up into the pyramid, into the tip of the pyramid, you go into the foods that are going to create the highest insulin response. And sometimes people talk about, I know I've talked often with people that are helping women with PCOS, and they have come out and recommended that these women cut out gluten and dairy. And I'm very supportive of that. Even though dairy is often part of a low carb diet, even though
Hmm.
it's lower in carbs, it can be lower in carbs, it can also have a very high insulin response in certain individuals. And I think that's well explained in our book. So although it's part of some low carb recipes, and I myself do consume some dairy, I think that if PCOS women were to remove those two simple things, although it's the hardest things to remove, right? Because most of the foods that we eat have either gluten or dairy. Um,
Hmm.
but I think those are probably of the food groups, as people like to call them, the ones that we probably eat more of and have a very high insulin response. Dairy it doesn't always have a high insulin response. It depends on the group of people. And in PCOS women, it probably does because they're more insulin resistant. The more insulin resistant you are, the more of a response you're going to have to dairy. For example, diabetics. Diabetics don't realize because when they measure their blood sugar doesn't actually go up very much after consuming dairy, but their insulin production is very high. So the next day, their blood sugars are higher.
Oh.
So they don't
Hmm.
actually pick up on this. So it causes a high insulin response. It might not necessarily cause a high blood sugar response. So people don't understand the relationship. It's a very important relationship though. So removing dairy and gluten, is that what I tell people? It isn't. It isn't what I tell people. Gluten for sure, because once you
Hmm.
remove grains and you go on a low carb diet, the gluten is gone. Okay. My concern
Hmm.
with telling people to remove gluten is that they're going to look for other gluten-free grains that are going to produce just as much of an insulin response. So again, you end up losing focus. But does gluten produce a lot of, gluten grains? Do they produce a lot of insulin? Yes, of course they do. I think
Hmm.
that's a step in the right direction for some people, but it's not going to get to the root cause of the problem.
Okay. Yeah, I asked this question because many doctors here ask women with PCOS not to consume cruciferous vegetables like cauliflower and broccoli. So, is there
Because of
any
the
truth attached
thyroid,
to that?
is
Yeah,
that
yeah,
because?
yeah. That
Yeah.
for that as well.
Okay. So in some cases, there seems to be a thyroid association, and I know that that's the fourth type of PCOS that people say, the fourth
Mm,
type, the PCOS, the thyroid PCOS. Although I think they might be associated because they're
mm,
both hormonal concerns. Not all women with PCOS have thyroid issues, and vice versa. Not all women with thyroid issues have PCOS. So if you're
mm,
giving that recommendation because somebody has a thyroid concern, and if you feel that to work, great. I am working with women that have insulin resistance, and all women with
mm,
PCOS have insulin resistance. So, regardless of whether they have thyroid concerns or not. So, that's a bit of a separate topic, how to
mm,
address thyroid. And
mm.
it isn't my main focus. My main
Okay.
focus is more of the not to say that there isn't some possible, anecdotal and otherwise evidence to that. I think
Hmm.
again, a lot of women that I work with eat cruciferous vegetables because they're part of the low carb food list and they do fine. Some
Mm.
don't because of
Okay.
the thyroid connection.
Awesome. And Dr. Nadia, do you provide any online consultations to? Well, but you did actually. You talked about in the beginning. So if so, then how can somebody contact you?
That's right. I work for the fastingmethod.com program. It's an online program. I provide
Okay.
online consultations. We also have a membership program with where we can chat in the forums, in the circles. We have support groups. I have a support group today on Tuesdays for women. Every Tuesday I have a support group. On Wednesdays I have a support group for people approaching maintenance. We have other support groups for behavioral and stress management, for diabetes, for weight loss. So I work specifically for this program as a right now as a fasting and dietary coach.
Hmm. Okay. And could you please highlight about your book, The PCOS Plan, and how it can benefit individuals with PCOS?
Absolutely. So our book is called The PCOS Plan, Prevent and Reverse Polycystic Ovary
Mhm.
Syndrome Through Diet and Fasting. It goes through a few chapters, as I said, introduction into myself and the women I've worked with. There's some great testimonials in there. Dr. Fung highlights what is PCOS, what's the current conventional treatment for PCOS, and then we go into how to actually treat PCOS. And in there, of course, we explain what is PCOS and
Mhm.
um, the many associated concerns and why it's such a serious and debilitating concern. Not just, as Dr. Fung says, not just a little bit of acne and a few missed periods. It's a lot more serious than
Mm.
this, and we need to address it. And then we have, as I said, I don't think that the audiobook, unfortunately, you don't get this part of the book, but there's a last section of the book, which is the practical section, which
Mhm.
has the food lists, it has the shopping lists, it has the fasting schedules, it has recipes. I think it has 50 recipes.
Wow. I'll soon be ordering the book on Amazon. Amazon's pretty famous in India,
Oh,
and
that's
their
good to know.
deliveries, yeah, and the delivery, the rates are really high. It's very efficient.
Oh,
Sometimes we
good.
get deliveries on the same day. So
Yeah, same. So even in Portugal too, even though Portugal doesn't
yeah.
have Amazon, a lot of European countries do. And so I get
Mm.
mine delivered from Spain, from Germany, from the UK. So I'm
Wow.
pretty lucky. And during, as you said, our book was released in April, and it was right
Yeah.
in the middle of the pandemic. So there was a lot of delays at the time. But right now, there's fortunately no more delays. Everyone I know of has gotten their book quickly.
Mm. And is there anything else that you'd like to add to our conversation?
No, I think we've addressed everything brilliantly. I'm very happy that a young man like you in this field of expertise that you're in is working with women and helping them look outside the box. And
Yeah.
um, I hope you support them through some of the concerns that they likely have because of hearing so much conflicting information.
Hmm. Thank you so much, Dr. Nadia. And Please keep doing the great work that you do, and I look forward to maybe working with you in the future. Thank you so much.
It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.